Hi, my name is Jillian Wade. I'm going to be presenting on Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovations theory. I chose this theory because I'm using this for the framework for my clinical scholarly project. So the basic summary of Rogers' theory is that new innovations are diffused by participants in a social system through communication channels over time. And diffusion can either be spontaneous, which is unplanned, such as somebody observing another person using a technique and then mimicking it themselves, or it can be directed, which is planned, such as management telling staff to implement a new intervention for fall prevention in a unit or something equivalent. So the key elements in this theory are innovation, communication channel, social system, and time. So Rogers defines an innovation as an idea, practice, or object that is perceived as new by an individual or other unit of adoption. A communication channel is any method that allows transfer of information between units of adoption. And the units of adoptions are called adopters. It can be an individual, a cluster within a social network. It can be an entire organization. It can be a country. Basically, it can be any group of people or even an individual. A social system is defined as a set of interrelated units that are engaged in joint problem solving to accomplish a goal. So this can be something like social media, like Facebook or Twitter, or it can even be like a nursing unit, like an emergency department. Any kind of social system can be used. And social systems in this theory also include internal influence, such as social relationships and distance from the opinion leaders, as well as external influences like mass media, social structures, legislature, organizational mandates, and other things like that. So the stages of innovation adoption, it starts with knowledge in this framework. The social system first has to be exposed to the innovation and then persuaded the next stage towards its implementation. At this point, they have to make a decision whether or not to use the innovation, implement it, and then finally confirm whether or not they will keep that implementation of the innovation or not. So these stages really outline this model's role as a change theory. As you can see, they're very similar to Prochaska's trans-theoretical model, also known as the stages of change, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with as nurses. Prochaska's stages are pretty close. They're pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And while the trans-theoretical model is great on an individual level, one of the things that were hit home with that theory in nursing school is often like assessing a patient's readiness to quit smoking or something like that. Whereas Rogers' diffusion of innovations theory is a better framework for looking at change at a systems level. However, both of those theories are not mutually exclusive to individual versus collective change models. So, Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory is applied in many different contexts, not just nursing. Other ones that I found in my research were business and fashion. And this comic here that I found comes from a business application of the theory, but it also really helps to delineate how the progression actually happens. So the innovators on the far left are the very first people to actually implement an innovation. So those are like the groundbreakers, the ones who are actually coming up with the new innovations. The early adopters come in when the innovation hasn't really caught on yet, but essentially it's not starting to trend. You can see after early adopters, there's the chasm, which the innovation has to clear in order to make it to the early majority, which is when the innovation really starts to pick up steam. The late majority buy into the innovation. Buying into it is essentially when you start reaching market saturation. The majority of the people in the social system are actually implementing it. The laggards at the far right would be the last people in the social system holding out, who are the last to actually implement the innovation. And you can see in the bottom right corner, I put essentially the non-comic equivalent of this graph. So you can see the bell curve of who is adopting this. Then you can also see the orange line behind, which is the market share. So by the time that all the laggards actually implement this, you reach 100% market share, which means essentially saturation of your innovation. So the article I chose to demonstrate the diffusion of innovation in a healthcare setting is Truland's From the Drawing Board to Bedside, Getting Ideas Through the System. So one of the examples they talk about in this article is patients with a spinal cord injury that having difficulty staying orally hydrated due to limited mobility. Essentially, they're often unable to reach their glasses of water, and they have to ask others for help, use a call light, do something equivalent to actually just get a drink of water. So the hydrant, which is a picture on the right, is a portable hydration system with a drinking tube that facilitates hands-free access to hydration. So this is the innovation in this article. The inventor of this actually did studies on this after having his own spinal cord injury, and he found that this using the hydrant for patients with spinal cord injuries reduces length of stay and use of medications for urinary issues. So the hydrant is kind of like one of those Camelback backpacks. You can see that there's a long drinking tube connected to a bladder that's filled with water, but essentially in this form, it's instead of a bladder, there's a water bottle. So the inventor of this, the hydrant, has already gone through the first few phases of the diffusion of innovation, and he found that his invention was embraced by the innovators who worked with him early on and the early adopters. But he was facing difficulty actually crossing the chasm due to lack of motivation by bedside staff to actually implement it. He found that unless nursing management made a mandate that these had to be used with spinal cord injury patients, that they were not being applied to all spinal cord patients due to resistance from bedside staff. So this is actually an example of somebody in the middle of the diffusion of innovation curve. So here are my references for Rogers' Diffusions of Innovations, our textbook, Schiavo's Health Communication, as well as the article I just discussed. Thank you very much.